Hey, this is Lisa Graves with the Midas Touch Network with Legal AF, and I'm here today with Connor Gibson, who is someone who I've known for many years and who I think is one of the best researchers in the country. My name is Lisa Graves. I'm with Court Accountability Action, and I am so happy to be here on the Legal AF channel to talk with Connor about the latest news about Charles Koch and the Koch nonprofit empire. You know, sometimes what we see in the news, there's a lot of villains out there, a lot of billionaires who have really emerged over the past few years to try to play a role in politics in America. But really, the granddaddy in some ways of them all is Charles Koch, who really started creating nonprofits in the 1960s. He helped really infuse the Libertarian Party with cash in the 1970s, even though he later claimed he only recently got involved in politics. That's what he said in the Wall Street Journal a few years back. But for the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, 2020s, Charles Koch and the groups that he has created and fueled have been playing a huge role in American society. And even though sometimes the reporters buy into the spin from Charles Koch's best PR a billionaire can buy, about how, don't worry, they're not going to be, don't worry about them, or they're distanced from Trump. And so it's all okay, even as Charles Koch and his nonprofit groups have helped fuel the Republican control of Congress and more. The reality is that Charles Koch has not given up on his ambitions to re-engineer America in his own image, which is a pretty right-wing, dark dystopian image in my mind. And the person I trust most in the world in tracking Koch's money and his spending is right here with us today and can give us the latest to break through the sort of fog of maybe disbelief that Charles Koch is still up to no good. So Connor Gibson, Connor has a Substack called Grassrootbeer. And he is just deeply knowledgeable about Charles Koch. And a few years back, Connor and I helped launch a thing called KochDocs.org, which was trying to capture some of the archive material that we and others had obtained about Charles Koch. But today we're going to talk about a new recent article that Connor prepared based on his excellent and super trustworthy research about the scope and ambitions of the Koch network circa 2022, 23, 24, 25, right up to what we know now. So welcome, Connor. It's wonderful to see you, my friend.
Wow. Geez, Lisa, I'm trying not to blush with this introduction. I probably should point out too, it's not often I do an interview where the host probably knows more about the topic than I do. So I'm looking forward to having this chat with you.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I am 100% certain you know these numbers from the most recent report better than me. But as our listeners may not know, Connor and I over the years in different ways have collaborated on trying to better understand the Koch network and what it's up to and how this myriad of groups, this sort of shell game of differently named groups that change their names, then change their name again and change their name. I call them disposable groups or disposable group names. Connor is the one who really has helped track that Koch network, that shell game over the years. So can you tell us a little bit about your most recent article and what your main findings were? Because it really is astonishing given how little Koch is in the news as Donald Trump consumes sort of all the oxygen along with Elon Musk, the sort of media oxygen out there. Tell us what you found.
Sure. So for the last few years, the Center for Media and Democracy has contracted me to do a few articles, and I've largely leaned into this type of subject, which is, I'm calling it Charles Koch's fleet of organizations. There are over 30. Most of these are nonprofits that are registered with the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. Some of them are Federal Election Commission registered political action committees and super PACs. And I was just curious a few years ago, what is the size of this group? If you're going to compare them to other major political players who sort of have both a business empire and a nonprofit apparatus, we've known for well over a decade that Koch is unique in that regard in terms of the scope and the size and the specialization of his nonprofit fleet, but didn't have great numbers to compare it with an emerging player, somebody like Leonard Leo, who is getting quite a bit of press scrutiny these days, while Charles Koch is not. Koch's nonprofit apparatus is much larger than Leonard Leo's, as large as it is. And so the tax filings from 2023 are the most recently available for most of these organizations, for the IRS, charities, and nonprofit organizations. So between those 34 organizations, they spent $833 million net in 2023. What is?
Wait,
what do I mean?
so let me pause there. So net spending is almost $1 billion in 2023, an off year, not a presidential election year, pre-presidential election year, not a Senate election year, but in the odd year of 2023. Wow.
Yes. And the gross spending was 1.5 million. So what am I talking about? Net versus gross. Charles Koch's fleet spends a ton of money on itself. There is a circular relationship between many of these organizations. Hundreds of millions of dollars are actually funneled between one and the other, and it makes it very confusing. That's part of the reason why I decided to look at this. So in 2023, they exchanged $715 million amongst themselves. So that's the difference between what I'm saying. Ultimately, $833 million went out the door to somebody else. But 1.5 billion was spent, and that's accounting for the 700 million plus that they spend on each other. And that's not even including, money that's spent on contractual relationships. I only am looking at the nonprofits because I can create a closed landscape where I know what money is ultimately coming in and out. But then there's Koch Industries, the company, as well as some other companies, mostly limited liability companies and C Corps that are integrated into these nonprofits. And those are all black boxes. We don't have access to their revenue or spending figures. So I need to caution that we're still only looking at an incomplete portion of Charles Koch's universe of organizations, and his son Chase Koch increasingly as well. But $833 million net spent in 2023. Net, they took in $624 million. They've got $8.2 billion in assets at this point. So an $8.2 billion piece of infrastructure that is adjacent to his company. And, largely the nonprofits being run by the executives at Koch Incorporated, the company. We can talk a lot probably about the qualitative and quantitative relationships between the corporation and the nonprofits, but they're unique in that regard compared to these other conservative mega donors, the foundations affiliated with the dead Bradley brothers or the late Richard Mellon Scaife. Those were a little bit different. Scaife was a corporate heir. The Bradley brothers were in charge of the corporate company, but a lot of these old money foundations are not still so closely related to the corporate fortune of which they were born. And Koch, that continues to be the case. Koch Incorporated is an active company, and it's growing and expanding every year.
Yeah, so let me just hammer a couple points on that, if you don't mind, or underscore them. But before that, let me just say, I'm the president of the board of the Center for Media and Democracy. I was previously the executive director, as Connor knows. That's how we first met when I was working over there at CMD, but I don't actually control CMD on a day-to-day basis. And Connor works with Arne Pearson and David Armiak and others over at CMD on the type of reporting and investigations that Connor is describing here. But the 2 points I wanted to flag, based on what you just said, that I think are really important for our audience to know are, first of all, Koch Industries, which now has a new name, as you point out. Koch Industries, as I know it in my head for many years, is one of the top two biggest privately held corporations in the United States. So it alternates sometimes. Some years it's the biggest privately held corporation in the U.S. Some years it's the second biggest privately held corporation in the U.S. And it is the product of the corporation that Charles Koch inherited in the late 1960s and then has expanded through acquisitions like of Georgia Pacific and other companies over time, along with futures trading in oil and other things. Its base infrastructure is predominantly, at least at the physical level, had been pipelines. Pipelines across the United States and pipelines and other refineries in the United States, as well as, relationships in other countries for building. And as Jane Mayer wrote about in her book, Dark Money, we learned from Jane how Charles Koch had inherited a company from his father that was built in part on building the refinery for Hitler's Luftwaffe during preceding World War II, and actually gained his initial fortune, Fred Koch, Charles's dad, from working for the Soviet Union in the 1920s, early 1930s. So the sort of roots of the company are there in those sort of those real totalitarian regimes. But since then, in the modern era, in the past 50 plus years, Charles Koch has been expanding his for-profit corporation, and it is privately held, meaning it's not traded on Wall Street. There's no actual public disclosures of its true revenue and its true expenses. And as a private company, it can give an unlimited amount of money to private causes. And in fact, 40 years ago, there was a lawsuit from one of Charles Koch's brothers about the fact that he was directing the company to invest in his personal political agenda, meaning his policy agenda, to use corporate money to invest in the nonprofit infrastructure that he was building back then in the 1970s and early 1980s. So when Connor says that $1.5 billion of money, that part of which stayed within the Koch empire, part of which went out to other organizations, that's just what we can see coming into or out of the Koch nonprofit infrastructure. That does not include, it does not necessarily include any checks from Koch Industries. Those could be buried within that funding, or it could be going, spent in other ways, just like if Charles Koch himself spent money himself from a trust account, not through a nonprofit, we wouldn't see that check. So we wouldn't see a check from Koch Industries or from a trust account. But what we see is what's moving between the nonprofit segments of Charles Koch's empire. And with that, I'm going to just toss a question back to you, Connor, about at one point when ProPublica was breaking the news about the huge gift from Barry Side to Leonard Leo, that $1.6 billion gift from the sale of a company to help to create the Marble Freedom Trust, which was one of the biggest gifts of its kind, sort of political gifts to advance this political or policy agenda. You pointed out that, in fact, Charles Koch had provided money to Chase Koch's operation that either equaled or exceeded that amount. Could you describe that a little bit for our audience?
Sure. And we know a little bit more now than we did when that happened as well. So there's a 501c4, which means it's a politically active nonprofit group. It has a little bit more permissibility in terms of what it can do on lobbying compared to a 501c charity, which is not, its political activity is permitted, but it's limited, right? So this 501c4, it was called CCK-C4, which stands for Charles Chase Koch, I believe, the son. Yeah. That's been since renamed. It's called Key Change now, which reflects how Chase Koch is using his musical ability as part of the Koch philanthropic effort and sort of their public relations charm offensive, which is really working. He was on Good Morning America earlier this year with Aloe Black, debuting an album named Stand Together, literally named after the Koch organization's Aloe Black's new album. So that was in 2020, I believe it was $1.2 billion in Koch stock. The company's private stock was transferred to this 501c4 that is now known as Key Change. And the year after that, or 2 years after that, another massive stock transfer occurred to an organization that's called Believe in People Incorporated. And that was, I believe, $4.3 billion. So over $5 billion in Koch Industries private stock was transferred to two of these groups. And that money, again, has been spun around from one group to another to another. It's highly liquid, I guess, within the network, how those funds are distributed. And that serves to ultimately make the source of the funds as well as the ultimate beneficiaries of the funds. It's just difficult to disentangle exactly how that money flows and why it is circulating in the way it does. And it's that, just in the last few years, $5 billion has been dumped into this group, it's an extraordinary amount of growth in a short period of time. And that's not to say that Barry Side's gift to Leonard Leo through the Marble Freedom Trust, which is very similar. It was a corporate stock transfer. The stocks got sold after the transfer occurred. And there's a major tax advantage built into that, which Koch actually lobbied for to have the law changed for that type of transfer to be a tax benefit to the donor. So they're similar in that way. And they're both very, very significant examples of that sort of exchange of corporate funding into a politically active nonprofit endeavor, and ultimately like acting as an endowment that could last for decades.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary sum, and when you say endowment, that's like, for example, if you just take the return on investment, basically, if you have a conservative return on investment of like 7%, but let's just call it 10, because they are perhaps more aggressive investors in their own way, 10% return on those assets, 10% of $5 billion would be $500 million to spend without ever cutting into the base, without ever cutting into that asset base. And so it's a substantial amount of money. And then if they dig into some of that asset base, they can spend even more. But there were 3 points that I wanted to highlight based on what you just said. The first was, the mention of Stand Together, because I'm seeing Facebook ads almost every day from Stand Together, basically suggesting that it's about bringing people together in the country. Meanwhile, that is sort of one of the flagship groups of Charles Koch, and Charles Koch's nonprofit empire, which includes Stand Together, but also which includes America's Prosperity, right now in the past few weeks has been busy pushing to make those tax cuts for billionaires like Charles Koch and Chase Koch permanent through the so-called beautiful budget bill, which is not beautiful at all, which is a destructive, terrible bill in so many ways. But that's, on the one hand, Charles Koch's operation is advertising to people on Facebook, claiming that it's the place for people to come together with that Stand Together brand. Meanwhile, its political operation is busy pushing through one of the worst budget bills in American history in terms of destruction for the rights and programs that help ordinary people, whether it's Medicaid or access to the ACA and more. And then, on top of that, you have the fact that Charles Koch's America's Prosperity, its Concerned Veterans for America, its Latino group, they all have been deployed in various ways to pack the U.S. Supreme Court to get this Supreme Court in place. And they've been winning before the Supreme Court in the cases they've been bringing to the judges that they helped install. And so you have, on the one hand, this sort of PR operation that claims it's all about uniting America. And on the other hand, you have these two components in terms of the legislative agenda in Congress, and also these congressional races and state races that Koch's money is invested in bringing right-wing people into positions of power, including this third vector on the court. So Koch has enormous influence, and this Stand Together thing with co-opting these musicians to basically whitewash or greenwash or greedwash is really astonishing. Can you talk a little bit more about that? The way that Chase has been reaching out to musicians to try to give some sort of gloss to the Stand Together brand, and what their goals are in your view, in your opinion.
Sure. So I mean, being familiar with Charles Koch's legacy, I take a pretty cynical view of all this, but I'm going to be as charitable as I can in its description, just for the sake of trying to be impartial and observing what's going on. So Stand Together, Chamber of Commerce, I guess, is the organization that is central in Charles Koch's fleet. Most of the money from people who bundle their political giving with Charles Koch are giving money to that organization. It is a 501c6 business league akin to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's basically the parent organization of Americans for Prosperity, and many of these other groups. They have sort of a formal structure that is very hard to disentangle, but some of it is disclosed in their tax filings. And Stand Together Music, as far as I can tell, is a name on paper brand of the Stand Together operation. There are many groups and limited liability companies called Stand Together, so I often have to specify which of the 10 Stand Togethers we're talking about. In this case, we're talking about Stand Together Music. It has a website. It doesn't specify whether or not it's a formal affiliate of any one of these specific organizations. So we don't actually know a whole lot about exactly how it's structured. But we do know that Chase Koch's two music-focused nonprofits are called Key Change Incorporated and Movement Music. And I'm going to assume that Stand Together Music, the website, is like a subsidiary of one of those, essentially. But if you go to Stand Together Music's website, you'll see DMC from Run DMC right on the homepage. You'll see Machine Gun Kelly. Their collaborators include Pitbull and Judith Hill and the Chainsmokers, and as well as people like Killer Mike, which, I don't know how Killer Mike politically self-identifies, but he's known as an ally of Bernie Sanders, a heavy critic of police violence against Black people. And there's photos out there now of Killer Mike shaking Chase Koch's hands at Wichita music festival events that are sponsored by the Kochs. You would think these folks are completely at odds. Killer Mike says "Kill Your Masters" in his song, but apparently he didn't mention that they're cutting him a check. So the goodwill that apparently is being afforded to the Koch family through these partnerships, I would say, is apparent. And this is where, their goals as Stand Together Music are not controversial. It's about providing sober spaces to people at music festival events, providing support for organizations that are helping with drug rehabilitation and addiction as a serious problem in the music industry. So these are laudable causes on their face, but this is coming from the family that stole millions of dollars of oil from the Osage tribe and has been fined millions upon millions of dollars for benzene pollution in Texas and contaminating groundwater in Minnesota, and groundwater in Arkansas, and you name it, union busting, and ultimately a policy platform that consistently involves siphoning resources away from people who really need it, impoverished people that Koch says its charity is supposed to support, and funneling those resources to wealthy people in the form of tax cuts and tax advantages and other sorts of incentives and handouts, which, Koch ideologically has professed to oppose for a long time. But when the rubber meets the road, it seems like they're fine siphoning government funds and using the private sector charities as a way to fill in these gaps, which obviously is not covering the basis of what people need in terms of healthcare and childcare and wages. So it's a complicated mess of sorts and very under scrutinized, as you said at the beginning of this interview. There's really just a complete lack of media interest in Charles Koch these days. It seems like all he had to do is get out there and said, yeah, I guess I'm okay with legalizing pot and we should get some people out of prison. And look, music, my son's a guitarist. And the scrutiny just seems to have reduced greatly, maybe because of the caricature like fascism that we see from the current administration. Donald Trump is such a blustering liar. He does seem extreme and compared to somebody who is capable of controlling their manners like Charles Koch. And so he's much more strategic in that way. But as you mentioned, this media narrative of like Koch versus Trump, Doge is trying to accomplish what Charles Koch and his late brother David said they wanted to do decades ago through the Libertarian Party platform and speeches that Charles Koch gave back in the 60s and 70s. They would love to abolish a number of federal agencies. Charles Koch said he wants to reduce the government to a night watchman to basically protect the private property of rich people. So even if they aren't satisfied with the tone and sort of the lack of manners from Donald Trump, they are getting a lot more from this administration than they stand to lose.
Well, that's right. And, Charles Koch has obtained such mileage from his non-endorsement of Donald Trump as president, from not endorsing him to be the president when he was running last year and previously. But Charles Koch has gained enormously from the actions of Donald Trump, including those tax cuts for himself and his family and other benefactors of his, political and policy agenda. But also, as you point out, Connor, that agenda, that Doge agenda, is right there basically in the Libertarian Party platform when Charles Koch was the predominant funder of the Libertarian Party, which was kill the Department of Education. Charles Koch didn't believe there should even be a Department of Energy. He wanted to get rid of OSHA or gut OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He wanted to stop mandatory vaccination. That was also one of the planks in that Libertarian Party platform from 79 and 80 that he, fully funded. If you go back and look at that platform, what you see is basically the precursor of Doge and this destruction of our, what they call the administrative state, what Charles Koch has helped get out there as the administrative state, which is really the programs that help Americans, contend with our economic situation, where if there weren't restraints on companies through, health and safety rules, we would have even more pollution. We'd have even more harm to workers. And so that's just like the tip of the iceberg of the whole thing. But Connor, I just so appreciate your coming on. I hope you'll come back on because I would love to continue this conversation with you about Charles Koch, about what we're seeing coming into 2025 2025, what we saw in 2024. I know you don't have the figures yet for 2024, but the writing and research that you've been doing for the Center for Media and Democracy is just superb. It's so important. And I'm so honored to have the chance to speak with you on Midas Touch, Legal AF, but please come back on. Will you come back on?
I would love to, please.
Yes.
Anytime you want to talk about this stuff, I'm happy to sit and learn too from what you have to say. I mean, we can talk all day. You could talk all day about what they've done with the Supreme Court, the major asterisk to come back to for the next time.
Yeah. Well, that would be wonderful, Connor. And thank you for coming on. Thank you all for joining us. Please subscribe. Please share. Please get the word out about Charles Koch. He's still having a disproportionate influence on American society in a very regressive way. And we will have Connor Gibson back on here soon to share more details about what the Kochs are up to, and also, what you can do about it or how people are responding to it. So thank you so much for coming on, Connor. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you, Lisa.
I'm Michael Popak, and I got some big news for our audience. Most of you know me as the co-founder of Midas Touch's Legal AF and the Legal AF YouTube channel, or as a 35-year national trial lawyer. Now, building on what we started together on Legal AF, I've launched a new law firm, the Popak Firm, dedicated to obtaining justice through compassionate and zealous legal representation. At the Popak Firm, we are focused on obtaining justice for those who have been injured or damaged by a life-altering event by securing the highest dollar recoveries. I've been tirelessly fighting for justice for the last 35 years, so my own law firm organically building on my Legal AF work just feels right. And I've handpicked a team of top-tier trial fighters and settlement experts throughout all 50 states known as big auto injury attorneys who have the know-how to beat heartless insurance companies, corporations, government entities, and their attorneys. Big Auto's attorneys working with my firm are rock stars in their respective states and collectively responsible for billions of dollars in recoveries. So if you or a loved one have been on the wrong side of a catastrophic auto, motor vehicle, rideshare, or truck accident, suffered a personal injury, or been the victim of medical malpractice, employment harassment or discrimination, or suffered a violation of your civil and constitutional rights, then contact the Popak Firm today at 1-877-POPAK-AF or by visiting my website at www.thepopakfirm.com and fill out a free case evaluation form. And if we determine that you have a case and you sign with us, we don't get paid unless you do. The Popak Firm, fighting for your justice every step of the way.